Imagine for a second tracing your family tree back like 300 years.
Right. Doing the math on your ancestors.
Exactly. You confidently do the math. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and it just keeps doubling.
Just a standard fanning out kind of shape.
Yeah, exactly. So by the time you get to your 4th great-grandparents, mathematically, there should be 64 unique individuals sitting in those slots on the chart.
64 totally distinct lives, right?
Right. 64 different stories, different genetic lines, all converging to, well, make you.
Mm-hmm.
But what if you look at the records?
Oh, boy.
Yeah. What if you look and realize you do not have 64 unique ancestors in that generation?
Which happens more than people think.
It really does. What if you look at the data and realize your family tree isn't a branching oak at all, but rather like a tightly woven looping circle where the exact same few people just keep reappearing on different branches?
It creates a really fascinating visual, honestly, because you expect a pyramid expanding outward into history, but instead you get something that looks more like a tangled ball of yarn.
A tangled ball of yarn. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, it completely defies our modern understanding of how populations expand, you know?
And that tangled ball of yarn is exactly where we are starting today. Welcome to a brand new deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
So today we are setting aside the headlines, we're skipping the famous historical figures, and we are embarking on a highly personal, deeply granular mission for you today.
We really are getting into the weeds.
We have this massive stack of sources, genealogical records, census data, faded clippings, family group sheets, and we're using them to reconstruct the life of one very ordinary man from upstate New York.
Nelson Peryea.
Right, Nelson Peryea. And just a quick note for you listening, the records spell it P-E-R-Y-E-A, but the family actually pronounced it Peryea.
Oh, that's interesting.
Peryea. Yeah, Peryea. So that is how we will be saying it today. But okay, let's unpack this. Why are we dedicating an entire deep dive to Nelson?
Well, Nelson's timeline is extraordinary, not because he was a president or a general or anything like that. It's because his 60 years on Earth perfectly encapsulate the massive tectonic shifts of the American century.
We're talking about a life spanning from 1892 to 1953, right?
Exactly. And to trace his life is to trace the agonizing transition from traditional agrarian isolation right into the consumer boom of the Roaring '20s.
And then straight down into the Great Depression.
Right, into the abyss of the Depression, and finally through the global meat grinder of World War II.
It's a mirror of the American experience. So to understand how Nelson navigated all this chaotic modernization, we really have to start by looking at the world that forged him.
The foundation.
Yeah, the deeply rooted and honestly surprisingly dramatic ancestral matrix that set the stage for his birth.
So he was born in 1892 in Altona, New York.
Right. To Aaron Nelson Peryea, born in 1849, and Arnedia Minnie Carter, who just went by Minnie, born in 1869. And the pedigree tree for these two in our source stack is just, it's absolutely wild.
It stretches way, way back.
All the way to the early 1600s. It features the first known marriage between a Frenchman and a Native American woman.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Martin Prévost, who lived from 1614 to 1691, and Marie Olivier Sylvestre Manitoulin-Bouche.
That union alone, I mean, that represents the fragile, nascent beginnings of North American colonial history.
It's the literal collision of two vastly different worlds coming together.
Yeah, just trying to survive the harsh realities of the early frontier.
And if that wasn't enough, the tree also includes direct descendants of John Carter.
Right, the kidnapping.
Yes, the man famously kidnapped from Deerfield, Massachusetts during a brutal raid in 1704. So you have this family history built on cross-cultural unions, borderland violence, and sheer survival.
It's like a movie script.
It is. But the most staggering detail in these sources isn't actually the historical cameos. It's a genetic phenomenon documented in the tree called the Poirier-Chartier collapse.
Which brings us right back to that tangled ball of yarn we mentioned.
Yes, exactly. What is that? Exactly.
So the Poirier-Chartier collapse is an extreme documented case of endogamy.
Endogamy.
Right. And endogamy is basically the sociological and biological practice of marrying strictly within a specific, highly localized community.
So you're not going very far to find a spouse.
Not at all. When we talk about early North American settlements, specifically in the rugged areas of Quebec and the northern borderlands of New York, we really have to remember that geography was destiny.
Because, I mean, before paved roads or combustion engines, your entire dating pool was dictated by how far a horse could walk in the snow.
Precisely. And the winters up there. In Clinton County and across the border into Canada, they are notoriously long and deeply, deeply cold.
And spring probably just brings deep, impassable mud.
Oh, absolutely. There was virtually no infrastructure. So if you were a farming family, literally clearing forests just to survive, you simply didn't have the time, the resources, or the physical means to travel 50 miles to court a spouse.
Right, you're not going on a weekend trip to meet someone.
No, you
Wow.
married the person on the next farm over, or the person from the only other family in your church congregation. Out of sheer survival and geographic isolation, these communities just turned entirely inward.
Which leads to the collapse. The notes in the pedigree tree state that through the ancestors François Chartier and Marie-Madeleine Dupree, there is this mind-bending concentration of shared DNA.
The numbers are wild.
They really are. The sources cite 216 DNA matches at the fourth great-grandparent level.
Wow.
I want to pause on that because the math is just staggering. Like we mentioned earlier, you are only supposed to have 64 ancestors in that generation.
Right.
So to have 216 overlapping DNA matches across 6 branches, it means the genetic grapevine is just endlessly looping back on itself.
The term collapse is genealogically very accurate here.
How so?
Well, a pedigree chart physically collapses inward rather than fanning out. The same specific individuals are occupying multiple different ancestral slots.
Like they're filling multiple seats in the same family tree.
Exactly. And we see the culmination of this centuries-long isolation directly in Nelson's parents.
Yeah, the records show his father, Aaron Peryea, was a first cousin to a woman named Julia Ann and simultaneously a second cousin to her husband, Paul Carter.
It's so intertwined.
It is, and meanwhile, Nelson's mother, Minnie Carter, existed within this exact same matrix as a first cousin once removed.
It really is a genetic bottleneck. I mean, imagine your family tree isn't a branching oak,
Oh.
but more of a tightly woven grapevine.
If you tried to map that out on a whiteboard at a family reunion, you wouldn't be drawing a family tree, you know? You'd be drawing a highly complex web where every node connects to 3 other nodes in the same tight circle.
Yeah, it would look like a spider web. While it seems striking to us today, we have to look at the mechanics of why this happened.
Right, it wasn't just random.
No, not at all. The Peryea family, who were originally Poirier, before the anglicization of the name, they were agrarian.
Completely tied to the land.
Exactly. Their wealth, their survival, their entire existence was tied to a very specific plot of soil. When a community is that heavily invested in the land, marriage becomes an economic strategy as much as a romantic one.
Oh, that makes total sense. Consolidating land.
Exactly. Consolidating land, keeping resources within a trusted network of relatives. You're relying on people whose work ethic you personally knew. That was the only way to endure the brutal realities of 18th and 19th century farming.
So that paints an incredibly vivid picture of the universe Nelson Aaron Peryea is born into in 1892.
A very closed loop.
Yeah, he is born into this deeply rooted traditional agrarian web where everyone knows everyone, everyone is related to everyone, and the blueprint for your life was written centuries before you were even born.
He's fully expected to just take the plow from his father.
Marry a girl from a familiar local family, and just continue the cycle. But what makes Nelson so compelling and what sets the whole narrative of his life in motion is that he completely breaks the mold.
He really does. He comes of age just as the technological and economic foundations of that isolated world are beginning to crack.
Okay, let's trace how that happens. Because in 1915, Nelson is around 23 years old, and the records show he receives a parcel of land from Minnie and Earl Peryea.
Right. And since his father Aaron had passed away back in 1909, it's highly probable this is a portion of the family farm.
Right, so at this exact moment, it looks like he is following the ancestral script. He is the farmer now.
But he doesn't stay the farmer.
No. Just 2 years later, in 1917, the script goes completely out the window. He sells the land to a man named Louis E. Peryea.
Selling that land in 1917, I mean, that is a monumental decision.
It's huge.
It's not just a real estate transaction. It is a severing of the agrarian tether that had held the Poirier-Chartier matrix together for literally centuries.
He's cutting the cord. And it coincides with another massive life event. That same year, on September 4, 1917, Nelson marries Layla Evelyn Giles.
Layla was born in 1899 in Beekmantown, New York, right?
Right, and they get married in Altona. And here's where it gets really interesting. The sources give us a wonderfully gritty, just totally unromantic detail about their wedding night.
Oh, I love this part.
So they stayed at a place called the Robinson Tavern, and a note in our files explicitly describes this tavern as being in a, quote, somewhat rundown condition.
It just strips away all that sepia-tone nostalgia we usually project onto history?
Seriously, it is the 1917 equivalent of booking a terrible one-star Airbnb for your honeymoon.
Just a terrible review, drafty room, peeling wallpaper.
Exactly. The floorboards are probably warped. There's a draft cutting through the room. The wallpaper is peeling. You have this young couple who just sold the family farm, stepping totally off the traditional path, and their first night as a married couple is spent in a creaky, rundown tavern.
But that leap of faith they took in 1917, it really sets the stage for a massive career shift.
It does, because when we pull up the United States Census records for 1920 and 1930, Nelson is not farming.
Not at all?
No. His occupation is listed as a Maytag washing machine salesman.
And that shift from clearing land to selling washing machines, that is the story of the American 1920s in a microcosm.
It's the dawn of the consumer economy.
Exactly. To understand the mechanics of this, you really have to realize what a washing machine represented in the 1920s.
Right, it wasn't just a minor convenience.
No, it was a technological revolution.
Because doing laundry back then was basically an Olympic-level endurance event.
It was grueling, all-day physical labor.
Yeah, I mean, what did that look like?
You were boiling massive kettles of water over wood stoves, violently scrubbing heavy, wet wool and cotton on ribbed washboards, hand-wringing them, and then hauling them out to hang and dry.
It's exhausting just hearing about it.
It destroyed women's hands and consumed entire days of domestic labor. The Maytag company recognized that if they could mechanize this process, they could tap into a limitless market.
But they faced a massive logistical hurdle, right? Because rural America wasn't fully electrified yet.
Exactly. So Nelson wasn't just selling a machine you plug into the wall.
So how'd it work?
Maytag pioneered machines equipped with small, fractional horsepower gasoline engines.
Gas-powered washing machines?
Yes. They were often called multi-motors, and they were specifically designed for farms without electricity.
That's wild.
So Nelson's job was to take this heavy, noisy, complicated piece of modern technology and convince deeply frugal, skeptical farming families that it was actually worth their hard-earned cash.
I really want to focus on the pure grit that job required. Think about the physical and psychological mechanics of being a traveling salesman in upstate New York in the 1920s.
That's not a desk job, that's for sure.
No. Nelson is driving a Model T or some similar early automobile up unpaved, deeply rutted dirt roads. In the winter, those roads are snowed in. In the spring, they are absolute mud bogs.
And he's hauling heavy machinery.
He's strapping a heavy metal washing machine with a gasoline engine to the back of this vehicle, knocking on doors, and honestly, probably offering to do the farmer's laundry for free just to prove the machine actually works.
It requires a completely different skill set than farming. I mean, on a farm, your success is dictated by the seasons, the weather, and your physical endurance.
Right. It's about outlasting the elements.
But in sales, your success is dictated by your charisma, your psychological resilience, and your hustle. You are operating entirely on commission.
Right. If you don't convince the farmer to part with his money, your own family goes hungry.
Exactly. The fact that Nelson successfully navigated this transition shows an incredible degree of adaptability. He recognized that the internal combustion engine and consumer credit were about to completely break the isolation of rural America.
And he positioned himself right at the vanguard of that change.
He really did.
But, adapting to that modern economy came with a terrifying level of pressure, especially when you look at the domestic reality Nelson was returning to after a long day on those muddy roads.
Yeah, his home life was intense.
Very. The 1920s brought him this exciting modern career, but it also brought a rapidly growing family. And with that growth came a brutal, unrelenting wave of heartbreak.
When we examine the family group sheets from this era, the demographic data just forces us to confront the biological reality of early 20th century domestic life.
The scale of it is almost hard to process today. Nelson and Layla had 11 children.
11.
Yeah. I'm going to list their names and birth years, not just to run through a timeline, but to really illustrate the relentless pace of life inside that household.
It's important context.
Right. So they start with Helen Ruby in 1918.
Right away.
Then Clifford Howard arrives in 1920, Warren Jason in 1921.
Back to back.
Vera Ruth in 1923, Roger Watson in 1924, Robert Clinton in 1925, Gerald Alvin in 1926.
Almost one a year at that point.
Exactly. Then Harold J. in 1928, Lloyd Clayton in 1929, Herbert Leslie in 1934, and finally Elaine Louise in 1935.
If you analyze the mechanics of that timeline, it is staggering. Layla was pregnant or nursing an infant almost continuously for 17 years.
17
Yep.
years.
From the time she was 19 years old until she was 36, her body was engaged in the physical demands of creating and sustaining new life.
Imagine the sheer volume of that household. The noise, the laundry, ironically, thank goodness Nelson had those Maytags.
Right.
The food required just to feed that many mouths. But the tragedy hidden inside that list of names is devastating. Between 1926 and 1931, a span of just 5 years, the noise in that house was shattered by loss.
Yes.
Nelson and Layla lost 3 of those children.
This is where the historical data ceases to be just numbers on a page and becomes a profoundly human story.
It really does. Vera Ruth was born in July 1923 and died in June 1926. She was almost 3 years old.
So young.
Then Lloyd Clayton, born in June 1929, died just 9 months later in March 1930. He was just an infant. And almost exactly 1 year after that, in March 1931, they lost Harold J. He was only 3 years old. And the sources give us the exact cause of death for Harold pneumonia.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, to understand how 3 children could be lost in such rapid succession, we had to deeply analyze the medical reality of the 1920s and early 30s.
Right, this is the pre-antibiotic era.
Exactly. Today, we view bacterial pneumonia as a highly treatable condition.
You just go get a Z-Pack or something.
Right. A doctor prescribes a course of amoxicillin, and the infection clears up. But in 1931, penicillin had not yet been mass-produced for the public. Bacterial infections were essentially a biological lottery.
And often they were a death sentence. So how did something like pneumonia physically operate in a household like the Peryas?
Well, it was incredibly opportunistic. You have to picture the environmental mechanics of a rural New York farmhouse in the winter.
Okay, so it's freezing outside.
Very freezing. And these homes were heated by central wood or coal stoves. The heat distribution was highly uneven.
Right, the kitchen is boiling and the bedrooms are ice boxes.
Exactly. Rooms on the periphery were freezing, drafts cut through the floorboards, and the air was often dry and filled with particulate matter from the stoves.
Which is terrible for your lungs.
Terrible. So when a pathogen like Streptococcus pneumonia entered a house packed with a dozen people, the transmission vectors were absolute. Once a toddler's immune system was compromised, the lungs would begin to fill with fluid.
And without antibiotics, the parents are just sitting there completely helpless.
Totally helpless. Medical intervention was largely palliative.
Like what? Steam tents.
Yes, steam tents, mustard plasters, just trying to keep the child warm. You were literally just waiting to see if the child's own immune system could fight off the bacteria before they asphyxiated.
Oh my God.
The agonizing, slow, physical decline of watching a child struggle for breath over several days is a trauma that is difficult for us to even comprehend today.
And the sources provide a really vital, chilling piece of context to prove that this wasn't just a danger to children with fragile immune systems.
Right, the obituary.
Yes, included in the records is an obituary for a man named Zephyr Carter. He was 52 years old.
A grown man.
And the obituary describes him as conducting a truck garden, well known, a hardy working man. And yet, it notes he expired at his home following an attack of pneumonia after being ill for just 2 weeks.
Zephyr Carter's death proves the sheer lethality of the disease landscape at the time. If a hardy 52-year-old farmer could be struck down in 14 days by the exact same pathogen that took 3-year-old Harold, it really reveals how precarious every single life was.
Death wasn't an abstract concept. It was a constant, hovering presence in the house.
Constantly there.
I really want you, the listener, to think about the psychological weight of this for Nelson. Put yourself in his position in 1931.
It's heavy.
You've buried a toddler. A few years later, you bury an infant. A year later, you were standing over the grave of another 3-year-old. How do you compartmentalize that level of grief?
I don't know if you ever do.
How do you wake up the next morning, put on your suit, go out into the freezing New York spring, and conjure up the artificial enthusiasm required to sell a luxury appliance to a farmer?
The psychological mechanics of that survival are astounding. I mean, in the modern era, a loss of that magnitude stops your world.
You take a leave of absence, you seek therapy.
Of course. But in 1931, Nelson didn't have that luxury. He had 8 other living, breathing children in that house, whose survival depended entirely on him making a commission that week.
He had to absorb the trauma and weaponize it into forward momentum because stopping meant starvation.
He had to keep moving.
But right as he is carrying this unimaginable personal grief, the macroeconomic ground completely gives way beneath his feet.
The Great Depression.
Yeah. The nation plunges into the Depression, the stock market crashes, banks fail, rural credit dries up instantly, and absolutely nobody is buying gasoline-powered washing machines.
Nobody.
The modern consumer economy that Nelson risked everything to join simply evaporates.
Which creates an incredible sociological dilemma. When the modern system that feeds you completely collapses, what are your options?
You can't sell appliances to people who have no money.
Right. And you don't have the ancestral farm to fall back on because you sold it in 1917. You are caught in the void between the agrarian past and the failed consumer future.
And that void brings us to 1936.
The height of the Depression.
The absolute nadir. The unemployment rate is staggering. Nelson is around 44 years old now. His son, Warren, is a teenager, about 15 or 16. And according to the sources, father and son take an axe and head into the woods.
And they build a cabin.
Together, they build a rugged cabin. And we only know about this cabin because of a deeply poignant note included in the records, written almost 50 years later in 1985.
That note is amazing.
The author of the note is recounting a memory of their father, Warren. They write, quote, "When I was a teen, Dad showed me a faded picture of a cabin, his story. At 16 years old, he and his father built a simple cabin during the height of the Great Depression when times were tough. In 1985, I asked Dad to take us there. This image closely matches the perspective of the original faded photo."
This detail is arguably the most evocative piece of evidence in the entire source stack because it forces us to analyze the mechanics of survival.
Yeah, why do it?
We have to push beyond just the fact that they built a cabin and ask why. In the middle of an economic collapse, caloric energy is incredibly precious. Why expend the massive physical calories required to fell trees, strip bark, notch heavy logs, and construct a building in the woods?
Was this just a practical hunting shelter to source free meat, or was it something deeper?
It had to be deeper.
I look at it as a psychological fortress. Let me push back on the romanticized idea of this just being a fun father-son bonding project, you know?
Oh, definitely wasn't that.
I don't think they went into the woods to bond. I think they went into the woods because Nelson was desperate to regain some sense of agency.
Agency is a good word for it.
Think about it. He couldn't stop the stock market crash. He couldn't stop the microscopic bacteria that drowned his 3 toddlers' lungs. Everything in the 1920s and 30s proved to Nelson that the world was chaotic, lethal, and entirely out of his control.
Right.
But he could control a tree, he could swing an axe, make a notch, and force the physical environment to yield to his will.
Yes, exactly. And by doing so, he is physically reverting to the ancestral survival mechanisms of the Poirier and Chartier lines.
Going right back to the roots.
When the 1920s consumer experiment failed, Nelson reached back into his genetic memory. The blood of the pioneers who cleared the brutal Quebec frontier was still in him.
It's like the cabin is the physical manifestation of him saying, the modern world rejected us, so we will build our own shelter.
And crucially, he didn't do it alone. He brought Warren.
Right. He brought his 16-year-old son into the woods at the exact moment Warren is transitioning into manhood. He is teaching Warren a very specific curriculum.
What to do when the world falls apart.
Exactly. When the economic system breaks down, when the banks fail and the sales dry up, you don't wait for a handout. You use your own 2 hands to construct your own safety. You build your way out of the despair.
And the psychological impact of that specific lesson is proven by the 1985 note.
Half a century later,
Warren is an old man, and of all the stories he could pass down to his own children, he chooses the story of the cabin. He takes his kid into the woods to find the exact spot where he and his father stood shoulder to shoulder against the collapse of the American economy.
It is a stunning legacy of grit. And thank God Nelson instilled that resilience in his boys, because while they managed to build their way out of the Great Depression, the 1940s were about to demand an even darker global sacrifice from the Peryea family.
The pivot from the 30s to the 40s is just brutal.
The localized poverty of the 30s was about to be replaced by the global inferno of World War II.
The sheer speed of that historical pivot is jarring. You go from worrying about finding enough food in the woods of upstate New York to being thrust into the most violent geopolitical conflict in human history.
And it arrives right at Nelson's front door in 1942. We have a copy of a draft registration card in the sources. The name on it is Nelson Peryea. He is 50 years old.
It is incredibly rare to see a 50-year-old man registering for a military draft.
Right, it seems so old for a draft.
It requires us to look at the massive logistical mechanics of the U.S. war effort. In 1942, the government instituted what was colloquially known as the old man's draft.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, they required men between the ages of 45 and 64 to register.
Oh, I mean, they weren't going to send 50-year-old Maytag salesmen to storm the beaches of Normandy, right?
No, no. The military had absolutely no intention of putting them in combat. But the scale of the two-front war against Germany and Japan required such a colossal amount of industrial and agricultural production that the government needed a comprehensive inventory of every able-bodied male in the country.
Oh, so they just needed to know who was left.
Exactly. They needed to know exactly who was available to build ships, manufacture munitions, or farm on the home front while the younger generation was sent overseas.
The fact that Nelson had to register just highlights the existential, all-consuming nature of the war mobilization.
It touched everyone.
And Nelson is signing that draft card, carrying a much heavier burden than just his own registration, because the sources include a newspaper clipping that reveals a fact that honestly stopped me in my tracks.
It's an unbelievable detail.
The headline reads, quote, "Uncle Roger in World War II," and the clipping states that 5 of the Peryea brothers served their country in this war.
5 sons from a single household. Statistically and emotionally, that is a staggering reality to comprehend.
Let's break down exactly where the geopolitical meat grinder sent these upstate New York boys. The clipping focuses heavily on Roger Peryea.
Uncle Roger?
Yeah. It states he served 21 months in the European Theater of Operations, the ETO. His roles were rifleman, messenger, radio operator, and acting sergeant in charge of communications.
He was busy.
Very. His medals are listed as a Good Conduct Medal, a Distinguished Unit Ribbon, the Combat Infantryman's Medal, and 5 battle stars.
We have to unpack the mechanics of what those titles and medals actually mean on the ground.
Yeah.
Because a radio operator in the European theater was not sitting comfortably in a tent with headphones.
No, they were out there.
Radio men were carrying massive, heavy communication rigs on their backs, often the SCR 300 backpack radios, which weighed nearly 40 pounds.
40 pounds of gear, just the radio.
Yeah, and they were the vital link between the frontline infantry and the artillery or command posts. Because of the antennas sticking out of their packs, they were prime, high-value targets for German snipers.
Wow. Because if you take out the radio operator,
You blind the infantry unit.
and he was also a messenger.
Yes. And when the radios failed, which they frequently did in the mud and chaos of Europe, messengers had to physically run coordinates and orders between command and the front,
Completely exposed.
completely exposed to mortar and machine gun fire. To survive that for 21 months and earn 5 battle stars, meaning he participated in 5 distinct major military campaigns, it proves Roger was in the absolute thick of the most brutal fighting in Europe.
So you have Roger dodging sniper fire in Europe. Then you have Clifford, who was a technician 5th grade in the U.S. Army, stationed in Japan.
Oh.
You have Gerald, ranked S1C, serving at the Naval Air Station on Whidbey Island, Washington. You have sons scattered across the entire globe.
Think about the logistical nightmare of communication for Nelson and Layla.
Oh man, there's no texting, no instant messaging.
None. You are relying on heavily censored Vmail that takes weeks to arrive. Imagine sitting in that house in New York listening to crackling radio reports of massive casualties in the Ardennes or the Pacific, knowing that 5 of your boys are out there.
Just waiting.
Every time a car idles too long at the end of the driveway, every time a Western Union telegram boy rides down the street, your heart stops. The psychological torture of that waiting is immense.
And tragically, the telegram boy did come down the street. The worst possible news arrived. The sources state that Robert Clinton Peryea, born in December 1925, was killed in action in Germany on March 7, 1945.
March 7, 1945. The context of that date makes it even more agonizing.
Because it was so close to the end.
Exactly. By March 1945, the war in Europe was in its final bloody throes. The Allies had crossed into the German homeland. The German army was collapsing, but they were fighting viciously in close quarters, urban combat to defend their own soil.
And Robert was caught in that.
He was caught in that desperate final stand. He was just 19 years old.
19. Barely out of high school. Let's connect the emotional dots here because it is overwhelming. Imagine being Nelson.
It's hard to imagine.
You survived the child mortality of the 1920s, totally helpless as pneumonia took 3 of your babies. You clawed your way out of the Great Depression with an axe in the 1930s to keep your family fed.
You did everything right.
You did everything a father could possibly do to protect your children from the dangers of the world. only to have geopolitics drag your 19-year-old son across the ocean to die in a field in Germany just weeks, literally weeks before the war ended.
It is the ultimate bitter irony of history. The Perea family, who for centuries had lived in deep geographic isolation, whose ancestors rarely left a 50-mile radius, is suddenly paying the blood price to resolve a global conflict.
It's so jarring.
It forces us to realize that macro history isn't made by politicians in boardrooms. It is paid for by ordinary families in places like Champlain, New York.
It is a devastating sacrifice. And as the dust of World War II finally settles, as the surviving brothers like Roger and Clifford return home undoubtedly carrying the heavy, invisible, psychological scars of what they witnessed, we move into the final chapter of Nelson's life.
He steps into a post-war America that is entirely unrecognizable from the world he was born into.
Totally different. The source material jumps ahead to July 1953. The Plattsburgh Press-Republican publishes his obituary. Nelson Aaron Peryea passes away on a Tuesday at his home on McBride Road in Champlain, New York. He is 60 years old.
60 years old. I mean, by modern medical standards, that is relatively young.
Yeah, it is.
But when you calculate the biological and psychological mileage on that man's soul, the grueling physical labor of the early 20th century, the stress of commission sales, the crushing grief of losing 4 children, it is a deeply heavy 60 years.
It really is. The obituary notes the legacy he leaves behind. He is survived by his wife, Layla, who remarkably lives until 1970.
Wow, she lived a lot longer.
Yeah. He is also survived by his daughters, Mrs. Helen Bosel and Miss Elaine Perea, and his 5 living sons, Clifford, Warren, Roger, Gerald, and Herbert.
The surviving boys.
The services were held at the Church of the Nazarene in Plattsburgh, and he was buried in the rural cemetery in West Chazy.
Synthesizing Nelson's life is really a masterclass in adaptation. He was born in 1892 into a horse and buggy, deeply endogamous society.
A world defined by DNA looping back on itself for survival.
Right. Yet he refused to stay static. He adapted to the mechanical dawn of consumerism by dragging washing machines through the mud. He weathered total economic collapse by returning to the ancestral skills of the woods.
And he died in the atomic age after his own sons helped shape the modern geopolitical map.
The geographic contrast alone is mind-bending, you know.
It really is. The pedigree tree at the start of his life was incredibly localized. His ancestors were a tight circle of farmers who never left the borderlands.
And his children.
His children's generation were scattered by global forces to the battlefields of Europe, the occupation forces in Japan, and the naval bases of the Pacific Northwest. Within a single generation, Nelson took a family deeply rooted in the upstate New York soil and launched them onto the global stage.
And the invisible thread connecting all of it is profound resilience. He absorbed the most violent, chaotic shocks of the 20th century so that his family could keep moving forward.
Which brings us to the end of this incredibly granular, deeply personal historical journey. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
It's a good one to think about.
Think back to that rugged cabin built in 1936 by Nelson and young Warren. The physical structure of it, the logs they notched, the bark they stripped, eventually rotted and faded away.
It didn't last forever.
No, by 1985 it was gone, existing only as a memory attached to a faded photograph. We spend so much of our time and energy trying to build visible things to weather the storms of life. We build houses, we build bank accounts, we build careers.
Trying to create permanence.
Right. But when you look at the entire sweep of the Peryea family, from the French native alliances of the 1600s through the brutal trenches of World War II, you have to ask yourself, is our true legacy actually the physical things we leave behind?
Or is it something else?
Or is our greatest legacy the invisible, unbreakable resilience we pass down to our children when we stand shoulder to shoulder with them in the woods when the world falls apart? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.